In 1989, on the outskirts of the city of Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg in the former USSR, a once great predator lay lurking undisturbed in the poplar trees in the forest. This beast had secretly remained undiscovered since 1943. However, this secret would not stay clandestine for much longer. Amid the poplars, sledging through the thawing ankle-deep puddles of another Russian winter thaw, a group of Russian hunters were searching for game, when suddenly the hunters literally froze in their tracks. But not as a result of the biting Russian cold, but at the presence of a very mature, very intimidating wolf staring directly at them. Shocked, the men found themselves face to face with this once fierce beast, because it was a wolf, but no ordinary wolf. A wolf that had long been extinct for over 45 years, or so they thought. However, this wolf wasn't a danger to the men at all. As a matter of fact, this wolf would be a one-of-a-kind find for the ages, and eventually this wolf would actually be reanimated and brought back to life and put on display for all the world to see. But this wolf was actually a hybrid because it was also a bird. A bird once so feared it was known by its horrifying nickname in years past as the butcher bird. Because this wasn't a four-legged beast, but it stood on two legs, and it didn't have imposing hooves or claws, but tires and wheels. Because what these rural Russian hunters stumbled upon wasn't an actual wolf, but what they did stumble upon in the middle of the Russian wilderness that day in 1989 was a nearly perfectly preserved 45-year-old German World War II fighter plane, a Focke-Wulf FW-190A5. The Focke-Wulf was once the most deadly feared fighter aircraft of all of World War II. Yet after 45 years of harsh winters and summer rains, the aircraft looked as though it had just landed in the middle of the forest recently, not 45 years before. The fighter was completely intact, free of rust with little deterioration at all, with its landing gear still retracted as it performed a gear-up belly landing the day it crash-landed there. But in the middle of a forest? How could this perfectly preserved relic have sat unmolested for 45 years and not have been discovered for nearly half a century? And how did it remain so perfectly preserved? And what about those trees? How did the trees not tear the wings off the plane when it landed? How did the engine and propeller remain intact? And even the paint was in nearly perfect condition down to its disgusting swastika on the tail. The preservation of the plane was and still is one of the most remarkable aviation barn finds in history. Other than some belly damage and decomposing fabric on the butcher bird's control surfaces, its condition was absolutely remarkable. So well preserved was the Focke-Wulf that the pilot's leather helmet and headset were even still intact, seemingly tossed on the floor of the aircraft as if the pilot had just recently left. Only the first aid kit had been removed by the pilot when he fled his crippled craft. If the Red Army hadn't got to him first, that is. But still there were those pesky trees. What about those trees? How did he crash land and not hit a single tree? Well, that's where the story of German pilot Paul Ratz, the man behind the stick of the forest wolf, begins when he crash-landed his Focke-Wulf at Voyabalka near St. Petersburg on July 9, 1943. But 45 years ago, when Paul Ratz landed there in the forest, it wasn't a forest full of full-grown trees as it is today. As a matter of fact, well, it wasn't a forest at all, but just a wide-open field filled with baby poplar tree saplings just beginning to take root. So at the time in 1943, it would have been a perfect spot for an emergency belly landing. As the years passed, the trees would grow over 50 feet tall around the aircraft. So that explains the trees. But then that still leaves us with another mystery. How did Paul Ratz end up there in the first place? And what was his fate? Because there were no human remains in or near the aircraft. And from all evidence, Paul Ratz walked away from the crash uninjured. Monday, the 19th of July, was a hot day at Ratz's forward air base, only 15 minutes flying time from the Russian front. He had been assigned an FW-190A5, number 1227 call sign White A, armed with an SC-250 550-pound bomb. He was flying in a two-plane formation. He and his wingman were side by side 200 yards apart as they crossed the Dvina River, which was the front line boundary. From there they headed east, and soon they found an armored train and attacked it through a barrage of Russian anti-aircraft fire. The Luftwaffe loss report claims that Ratz's aircraft took flak hits, but none are to be seen in the video of the aircraft. Nevertheless, its BMW 801 engine failed catastrophically, forcing Ratz to glide to a landing in a field of poplar saplings. Ratz removed his leather flying helmet and left it in his seat, where it was found 46 years later. He opened the rear fuselage to retrieve a first aid kit. Oddly, he also snatched the aircraft clock for some reason as a souvenir before heading off the dozen or so miles back to the front lines on foot. But he never made it. The Luftwaffe loss report still lists him as vermisst, which means missing in action. German Sergeant Paul Ratz crashed about 2 years into the 2.5-year siege of Leningrad, the most deadly siege of war in human history that saw over 1 million Red Army troops killed with over 2 million wounded and over 1 million civilian fatalities in the defense of Leningrad. The Russians were vengeful when it came to capturing German soldiers, and with good reason, due to the brutal way the German soldiers treated Russian POWs and civilians alike on their march to Leningrad. Now, before I tell you if Paul Ratz was captured and taken prisoner or executed by the Russians, we need to talk about what came next for his aircraft that was found suspended in time in a Russian forest. In 1991, the plane was taken out of the forest by helicopter and studied. In the 1990s, efforts were made to fix it. Later, it was purchased by the Flying Heritage Collection owned by the late Microsoft's Paul Allen. He completed the restoration in the United Kingdom and the United States. During the restoration, it was discovered that the fuel lines were all blocked, and it was then that it was discovered that a cloth rag was shoved into an oil line in the engine. But the million-dollar mystery was exactly how could that rag possibly have gotten inside a closed oil line? After all, it was a brand new, just factory-installed engine. BMW never did major engine maintenance on German aircraft in the field. When an engine needed repaired, they removed the entire power egg, as it's called, and the complete engine on its mount and shipped it back to the BMW factory in Germany for repairs. Well, as it so happened, Allied prisoners of war often worked in German factories, so one of them might have sabotaged the engine. So the prevailing theory is that an Allied POW or slave laborer sabotaged the engine, stuffing a rag, and some reports also said there were clumps of dirt as well downstream from the oil filter so that the engine only worked for a brief period until it failed. Okay. So the Russians didn't shoot the plane down, which is evidenced by the fact that there were no bullet holes in the plane. Then the obvious answer was that it was sabotage. But Maximus, what about the pilot Paul Ratz? What happened to him? Well, I'm glad you asked, and I'm going to tell you. Paul Ratz made it only a few miles before he was captured and surprisingly not shot on the spot, as one would have expected. He was instead taken prisoner by the Red Army, where he remained in a Russian prison for 16 years, finally being released by the Soviets in 1959. So not only was it amazing that Ratz wasn't shot down and survived the landing, but less than 10% of the German prisoners taken captive by the Soviets survived. So Ratz was doubly lucky. However, his opinion may differ. Sadly, though, no one ever got the chance to ask Ratz about the amazing find of his pristine, downed FW-190, because unfortunately Ratz died in 1989, having never learned that his airplane had ever been found. Perhaps it was better for him to not have known that after he spent 16 years in a Soviet prison because his plane had been sabotaged, rather than at the hands of the Red Army in the midst of the fierce battle for Leningrad. However, his family did learn his fighter had been recovered. But they were in possession of the clock that rats had taken, so I'm sure he must have told them the story years ago, after being released from the prison in the USSR. Much of the aircraft's airframe restoration was done by the highly regarded English shop JME Aviation, which unfortunately closed in 2010, and the aircraft was shipped to the US for completion. The BMW engine was totally rebuilt by Mike Nixon in Tehachapi, California. Nixon is the country's and perhaps the world's preeminent restorer of World War II era aircraft engines at both his vintage radials and B-12 divisions. Many had feared that due to its rarity, Allen's airplane would never be flown even after the restoration was complete. But Paul Allen, being Paul Allen, refused to believe that. And after he eventually restored the F-190 to better the new condition, using original parts or parts built based on the original drawings, the refurbished FW-190 made its first flight on December 2, 2010. And the Flying Heritage Collection has displayed this unique Luftwaffe fighter in the air publicly and on display at its Everett, Washington Museum ever since. I believe it's still the only working FW-190 in existence, but that could have changed in recent years. So if you know of other F-190s that are airworthy, please let me know down below. The Flying Heritage Museum collection features aircraft from all sides of the war, including 3 of the 24 remaining Focke-Wulf F-190 fighters in existence. Now, I know in the thumbnail I called this a, quote, barn find, which is a term usually reserved for classic cars stored away in barns and garages. But if you want to be technical, we can call this a barn yard find. So how about that? Quite an amazing story indeed. Hey, if you've ever been to the Heritage Museum or actually saw Ratz's 190 flying at air shows, please make sure and tell me all about it in the comments section down below. Well, that's going to do it for now. And as always, thanks for stopping by. If you would be so kind and consider subscribing, I'd appreciate it. And on your way out, don't forget to like, share, and ring the bell. And of course, remember...